Chapter 2. Well-being. Secrets half expressed and never quite explained, and yet I understand them. I rather like that. Contentment and harmony, concord and unity in motion. It's pleasing to me. Perfect total symmetry. No. There is a discordance, a dissonance. Something unexpected and out of the plan. I don't like that. It impinges upon my awareness, disturbs me with its intent of purpose. It upsets all that I comprehend. How many dimensions can I fit into a box? How many spaces can I fit into one instant? But then dimensions are relative, which must mean they are all the same. They were all the same, the scruffy little man thought grumpily, as he absently sucked the finger he had just used for scratching his ear. Tell them one thing, and it was 10 to 1 that they would go off and do the exact opposite. At least Ben had the good sense to stay in the TARDIS while he stopped off to replenish his stocks of mercury. But Polly, oh no, not Polly. She said that she wasn't going to be cooped up in the ship while he went off and had all the fun. You might have thought she'd have learned her lesson by now, the little man had said. After all, their travels together had hardly been uneventful. Daleks, Cybermen, even cutthroat smugglers. Hadn't she better stay in the safety of the TARDIS and start showing a little bit of sense? And at that, she had retorted that it was probably time that he started showing a little bit of sense. That had hurt. It wasn't his fault that the TARDIS's mercury supplies were seriously depleted. He could have sworn he'd stocked up several trips ago. And nor was it his fault that he noticed the lack only when they had just left a planet whose mercury swamps ensured abundant supplies of the element. So she had stormed out of the TARDIS. She wasn't in any danger, of course. The little man knew the planet and its inhabitants well. They were a highly advanced and peaceful race, living in small communities and tolerant of strangers. But it wouldn't do her any harm at all to see just how well she could really get along without him. So the little man had purposefully taken his time renewing his stocks of mercury, and it was several hours after Polly had left the TARDIS before he began looking for her. And of course, now that the time had come, he couldn't find her. As he walked the narrow streets of the settlement for what seemed like the 100th time, he sulked like the little child he often pretended to be. "Are you lost, sir?" He looked down at the small red-headed girl tugging at his dirty frock coat. She was carrying a battered doll under one arm, and the dirty streaks around her eyes told him that she had recently been crying. There was a look of concern on her face. "Am I lost?" he repeated, and rubbed his chin thoughtfully, considering the question as he might do a complicated equation. "Well, I don't think so. Not this time, anyway." He crouched down beside the girl and gave her his most charming smile. She grinned back. "But I think my friend might be lost," he said. "Have you seen her?" "The tall lady with the blonde hair?" the girl offered. "Yes, that's her," nodded the little man. "Her name's Polly. Do you know where she is?" "She's over by the marketplace," she replied, and indicated the way. The scruffy little man thanked the girl, but as he stood up to go, she tugged at his sleeve. "Sir?" she ventured and offered him her doll. He sat down cross-legged on the floor and examined the broken toy. "Everything gets old and falls apart in time," he said philosophically. "Even happens to me." The child's face fell until he added, "But most things can be fixed. Let's see what I can do." The side of the rag doll had been ripped open, and its stuffing was beginning to fall out. One eye was loose and connected to the smiling face only by a single thread. The little man emptied one of his pockets, coming across a pair of conkers, a yo-yo, a bag of glass marbles, and an old banana skin, before he found the needle and thread he was looking for. With the expert hand of a tailor, he set about stitching the doll together again. His task finished, he handed the doll back to the little girl, who inspected it closely and then smiled. "Thank you, sir," she said, and then as an afterthought, "I like you. You're nice." His jade-green eyes twinkled with delight. "And I like you too. Would you like to hear a tune?" The little girl nodded, and he took an old battered recorder out of his top pocket. He warmed even more to his new friend as she clapped her hands and began to dance in time to the music he was playing. The scruffy little man smiled smugly. At least there were still people who appreciated good music, he thought. Just let Ben and Polly complain about his playing again. When he had finished, the girl smiled sadly and said, "I must go now, sir, otherwise I'll be late for school." She pointed to an approaching figure. "And there's your friend now." The little man looked up as Polly approached. He blinked, shaking his head as his vision blurred. The girl must be mistaken, he thought. Polly didn't have long dark hair tied back in a braid, nor did she have a penchant for lycra leggings, an oversized leather jacket, and Doc Marten boots. And Polly's voice was 1966 Rodin, vintage, while this one came very definitely from Perivale, West London, circa 1990. "Oi, Professor! Wake up! Is there anyone in there?" The doctor shook his head again and his vision cleared. He was in the main control chamber of the TARDIS, standing by the central mushroom-shaped console, his hands poised over the controls. The transparent column in the middle of the six-panelled console was slowly falling to a halt, and he found his hands skipping automatically over the instruments, guiding his time machine into a safe, if somewhat shuddery, landing. Then he realised that someone was tugging at his sleeve. "Doctor, are you all right?" The doctor raised a hand to his forehead and breathed deeply. "Ace, where was I?" His companion shrugged her shoulders. "Dunno. 1 minute you're humming a Miles Davis tune, and the next you're totally out of it." "Out of it? How long for?" "Couple of seconds, 5 at the most." "Are you sure you're okay?" "Yes, but nothing like this has happened before. Like a voice from my past telling me something, reminding me." The doctor frowned. The memory was already fading fast. "I was looking for Polly. Yes, that was it. A long time ago." "Polly? Isn't that the stuck-up Sloane Ranger you told me about?" asked Ace. "Don't worry, Professor. She'd probably only ask you for a contribution to Conservative Party funds." The doctor's impish face broke into a fond smile, and he chucked his companion on the chin. "Well, she speaks very highly of you." "How come? I've never met her." "Yet." The doctor grinned infuriatingly and turned his attention back to the console. His apparent good humour was for Ace's benefit. Now, in his 7th incarnation, he prided himself on his level-headedness and command of the TARDIS, so different from that of his previous selves. This temporary lack of consciousness and the implication that he was losing control of things disturbed him deeply. He activated a touch-sensitive control and looked up expectantly. The panels in front of the scanner screen remained closed. He tutted and jabbed at the control again. "The TARDIS is getting as absent-minded as you," Ace said. The doctor merely looked at her. She remembered what she had been meaning to ask him since the previous day. "Professor," she said, "this is probably a silly question, but are there any animals in the TARDIS?" The doctor was glaring at the scanner. "What?" he said absently. "Well, it's just that yesterday morning I thought I saw—" "Aha!" the doctor shouted, as the panels in front of the screen slid reluctantly apart to reveal the scene outside the TARDIS. "The planet Kirith," he announced grandly, tapping the lapels of his brown jacket and sounding for all the world like a lecturer eager to show off to his students. "The only planet circling a red giant in the galaxy known to you as QSO0046, at the very edge of the explored universe. Gravity Earth normal, with a slightly higher oxygen and nitrogen content. Lush vegetation, few predators, and a particularly interesting native life form." "I'm not impressed, Professor," said Ace. "It still looks like a wet Wednesday in Margate out there." The doctor winced. Ace did have a point, he thought, as he looked at the picture on the screen. The TARDIS had materialised on a rocky promontory, facing onto a storm-tossed and vicious sea. Sporadic bursts of ball lightning illuminated the dark brown night sky. Seabirds wheeled and turned, struggling vainly against the howling wind and rain. Huge trees on the nearby black cliffs creaked and swayed as the wind thundered through their branches. "Well, it's still a young planet," the doctor said apologetically. "The climate is bound to be a little unstable." Ace gave a sniff of disapproval, as though she didn't think that was a good enough excuse. As she turned back to the doctor, she missed seeing the dark silhouette of something, which had been hiding behind a rock observing the appearance of the TARDIS. "And we're not on a holiday joyride anyway." There was an uncustomary note of irritation in the doctor's voice as he drew her attention to a counter blinking steadily on the console. "That's what we're here for." "The Timewyrm," Ace whispered. "I thought perhaps she'd gone for good." "No such luck, I'm afraid. We've tracked her down again." The Doctor had saved the embryonic human civilization of Mesopotamia on Earth from enslavement by a mind-devouring alien creature who had set herself up as the goddess Ishtar in the city of Kish. He had to pay a high price, however. Ishtar, already more machine than living creature, had fused with the computer virus that the Doctor had hoped would destroy her, and had then escaped into the microcircuitry of the TARDIS. In order to prevent her taking control of the ship, he imprisoned her in a section of the TARDIS that he was able to jettison into the space-time vortex. Even this was not enough to annihilate the being that Ishtar had become. The chronivores who inhabit the vortex named her Timewyrm, because she learned how to use the TARDIS systems within her to slide back and forth through time. The TARDIS, the Doctor, and the Timewyrm were now indissolubly linked. The TARDIS had tracked the Timewyrm to 20th century on Earth, where the Doctor restored the timelines that she had disrupted and scattered her across space and time. The Doctor had suspected that she would be able to reassemble herself, and the winking light on the console was the depressing sign that the TARDIS had detected the Timewyrm's presence and had brought them to Kirith. "So if this Timewyrm thing is here, what do we do when we find it?" asked Ace. "Or when it finds us," she added morbidly. "Destroy its power utterly, even at the expense of everything else, and wipe out all trace of its ever having been." The Doctor spoke with grim determination, and there was an adamantine glint in his eyes. And then abruptly he continued in a much lighter tone. "Anyway, I've always wanted to come here. Do you know that Kirith is one of the strongest sources of Artron energy in this quadrant? It's so powerful that back in the 1990s, Earth astronomers mistook it for a quasar." "Give me a break, Professor," Ace pleaded. "Until a minute ago I'd never even heard of Kirith, let alone Artron energy." She sighed, hoping the Doctor wasn't going to insist she'd look up the relevant entries in the TARDIS databanks. Much as she trusted and respected her mentor, there were times when his insistence that she find out things for herself reminded her a little too much of school. "Long, long ago the Time Lords harnessed an energy force hidden deep within the mind. Channeled properly, it can be used in many different ways. For instance, without it no TARDIS could function properly," he explained airily. "Several other highly advanced species can tap it to some degree, but why should there be so much of it on Kirith?" "A Time Lord stranded here and he's putting out a distress signal," Ace suggested. "An amoeba with delusions of grandeur is sending out a message to any intelligent life form listening in." "Shall we find out?" asked the Doctor, and stalked over to the mahogany hat stand in the corner. He threw himself into a brown duffel coat, jauntily jammed a pork pie hat onto his mop of brown hair, and propped a multicoloured umbrella over his shoulder. "Can't we wait till the sun comes out?" "Time might be relative, but it's not infinite," the Doctor reproved. "Besides, there's a town close by we can shelter there. Doors, please, Ace." Ace's hand hesitated over the console before selecting the correct control. The Doctor had recently felt it was finally time that she learned some of the basic control functions of the TARDIS, and she was anxious to prove that his lessons had not been in vain. She looked up with disappointment. The double doors at the far end of the control chamber remained resolutely shut. The Doctor raised an admonishing eyebrow. She began to protest when the doors slowly opened. The Doctor stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Delayed reaction? Rusty hinges?" Ace suggested as she picked up her backpack from a chair and slung it over her shoulder. "Possibly," said the Doctor. and walked out onto the surface of the planet Kirith. Not far from where the incongruous shape of a 1960s London police box had landed, a young man sat in the shelter of a tree, watching the waves and the rain as they crashed against the rocks and turned the ground to mud. He munched thoughtfully on a wafer he had taken from the small parcel beside him. He was tall and handsome, with the lean body of a swimmer, and his dark, almond-shaped eyes sparkled in his finely chiselled face. As he pulled back his long, wet hair, he wished, not for the first time tonight, that he hadn't ventured out into the wilderness in this weather. Unfortunately, he very seldom listened to his friend's advice. But his sensible, level-headed, unimaginative friends did not have the dreams he had. They had begun a year ago, as a nagging voice in his sleep, calling his name and whistling an indistinct but oddly familiar tune. He had gone to a physician, who had provided him with a delta wave augmenter on the back of his neck, which had given him dreamless sleep for some months. But the dreams fought back, and when they finally returned they were stronger and more vivid than ever. In his dreams his black hair was short and closely cropped, so he knew he was 14 again, his days his own, while his teachers and the brethren debated his future following his parents' death. He would spend his time in the highlands and the moors where the view of the stars was best, or on the cliffs or shore, looking out for hours at the vast and formless sea. Usually he was alone, but occasionally he was aware of someone else, a friendly, laughing presence. But when he turned to look, there was nothing but an indistinct blur beside him. Then the last dream came. Though he could see nothing, he knew that he was sitting somewhere by the seashore. It was a sunny day, the weather gloriously warm. With a branch he was glumly prodding the skull of a dead cat. The words in his head rang, as clear and distinct as a bell. "I think you're mad to go." "My mother thinks it's a good idea, and so does Revna." "What does Revna know? All she's interested in is herself. With you out of the way, she can be Mummy's little girl again." "But it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I need to practice, study. My playing hasn't been as good as it used to be." "Sounds good enough to me. And 10 years, with only that miserable bunch of geriatrics and their creepy servants for company." "You shouldn't talk disrespectfully of the Pangistri, or their companions." "Why not? They can't hear us up here. So when do you go?" "In a few months' time. I leave for Kandassi by the harbours after some instruction from Huldar." "And there's another boring old goat for you. Do you really want to spend the next 10 years of your life with people like that?" "Raphael, you're my best friend. Even if you don't approve, be at the harbours when I go." "Just don't expect me to look after your sister when you're gone. And I still think you're mad." The next day he had told Revna of the dream, but she had just looked at him blankly. She had never had a brother, she had told him frostily. If he didn't believe her, he could always ask her mother. Over the following days the dream returned to him, nagging at his brain even during the day, until he resolved somehow to seek out the place he had been in his dream. So it was that he now found himself sheltering under a tree on a storm-cracked night, trying to make sense of the teasing half-memories which buzzed infuriatingly around his mind. He sat there for hours, fruitless hours, when he silently went over his suspicions. His dreams, he felt, were not imaginings, but forgotten memories which needed only the right stimulus to be reawakened. And then, as he stared up at the twin moons of Kirith, the vague memories and suspicions finally coalesced into a sudden and painful flash of remembrance. Raphael became the first person in 10 years to remember Darian, the musician who went to join the Pangistri on the island of Kandassi. Like a blind man suddenly given sight, Raphael became confused and disorientated as the memories of his friend crashed indiscriminately into his mind with cruel vividness. He remembered the childhood games he and Darian played together, the teasing of Darian's older sister. He remembered the teenage scrapes they had got into, how Darian had taken the blame when it had really been Raphael who had scrawled the childish, but true, graffiti about Lord Hulda's personal habits on the council house wall. He remembered his friend's music, but not the times when it had made him fall asleep. He remembered the Lord Reptu instructing Darian to say goodbye to all his friends at the harbours of the Chosen 10 years ago. 10 years ago! Raphael stumbled to his feet. Tears of unfamiliar anger and despair filled his eyes, and he looked wildly about, unsure where to turn. Finally, like everyone else on Kirith, he looked seawards. There, through the driving rain and hail, serene and admonishing in its fastness, was the island of Kandasi. The sky cracked open as a sheet of lightning illuminated the night. Hidden behind a tree, Raphael thought he could see a dark shape. He could make out a blue, frightened face and eyes which gleamed in the sudden light and then vanished. Startled and disturbed by the noise and sudden brilliance, Raphael turned and lost his footing on the slippery rocks of the shore. With a cry he fell headlong into the water, gashing his side on the needle-sharp rocks. The waves dragged him mercilessly along down the narrow channel which led to the open sea. Frantically he tried to gain control and swim against the current, making for the overhanging trees and branches along the shore. But his boots and bulky clothing hampered his movements, and the flow of water was too strong. Like a spider remorselessly drawing in a fly, the current carried him further and further down the bay, towards the mouth of the open sea. A piece of driftwood smashed him in the face, and hot blood streamed down into his eyes. The world swam about him, and his vision became blurred and dizzy. Salt water gushed into his mouth, making him retch. Then dimly he heard voices above the roar of the wind and the sea, and through his daze he thought he saw someone on the shore. It was a girl, with one arm around an overhanging tree, and the other around the waist of an older man, who was reaching out to him with a long stick. Dreamily, Raphael realised that they were trying to save him, and with numb, aching fingers he grabbed the curled end of the man's stick. Grunting with exertion and cursing in a long-dead language, the man dragged Raphael's almost unconscious body ashore. Raphael heard the girl shout above the roar of the wind, "Professor, is he—" The man in the brown coat and oddly patterned jumper shook his head. Raphael was aware of him checking both sides of his chest for his double heartbeat. "He's bleeding badly. There might be concussion," the man cried out. "We must get him some medical treatment." "Back to the TARDIS, then?" "Definitely not. We must take him to the town." "How do we know where that is?" "Follow me. I know the way." And then Raphael blacked out.